So this evening we're going to look at mostly churches of North Africa. Movements were named after men, the Donatist and the Novatianist. But they were centered in North Africa, even though their influence actually was very, very wide, as we'll see. Often and perhaps usually, decline in the church through the ages doesn't start with doctrine as much as it starts with practice. And so that we get slack. We let things slide before our doctrine changes. And that's why, it's part of I'm digressing already, but it's part of why, the issue, even with what is called contemporary Christian music, is what it is. It's not always the beat. It's not always that every song that they write is horrible. But it is a culture of compromise. And that is the issue. And it's what we're going to look at in these two movements that cover pretty much 300 or 400 years, I guess 300 years, starting with the mid-3rd century on up to some of them last up into the 7th century, but most of it's going to be centered in the 3rd and 4th centuries, most of the action. But I want to remind us 2 Corinthians 6. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. As God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord. And touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. So what we're going to see is not doctrinal division as far as the person and the work and the nature of Christ that we see in the Arian controversy that arises and Constantine deals with and calls the Council of Nicaea. It is not about baptismal regeneration. It is about, are we going to be pure as a church? And so starting in the mid-3rd century, there was an elder in Rome by the name of Novatian, who led a group called, at that time, Cathari, which means pure. By the way, most of the things that I'm reading are actually from non-Baptist historians. This is mostly from Philip Schaff's History of the Christian Church and the older Eusebius Ecclesiastical History. Interestingly enough, Novatian lived in Rome. We know the significance of Rome. The gospel's already gone to Rome. But at the same time now, Rome is going to into decline. But the controversy surrounding Novatian extended to Africa, and that's going to be significant to us. Persecution's coming because of the Roman Empire, because the Roman emperors would rather the people worship the Roman gods, especially the Roman emperor. And if you'll recall that in those days, Christians were called atheists because they wouldn't believe in no God other than the God of the Bible. Here's an interesting thing. There was a guy named Novatus in Carthage, North Africa, who was a Novationist. He was in fellowship with the Novatian in Rome and the people there and their principles of separation. This is important because if you'll recall, week before last when we talked about the Montanist and the Tertullianist, well, Tertullian was in Carthage, Africa. These are not separate movements. These church historians who follow the Romanist Protestant view these as separate movements. But the Montanists were in Carthage. Novatus was in Carthage. You know, if you look into the Reynolds household and you see children that look like Reynolds, it's only right to assume that they probably have Reynolds birth certificates and Reynolds DNA. We're looking into Carthage and we're seeing Montanist DNA, Christian Baptistic DNA, so to speak. There's one thing we do need to notice. Eusebius records a letter in which there was one Cornelius who opposed Novatian and said that he had not been truly baptized, but that on his deathbed they poured water around him. That comes from an angry enemy. You know what angry enemies tend to do? They tend to lie about you. D.B. Ray in his Baptist Succession declares Cornelius did lie about Novatian on other things, and so we should probably not believe him on this matter. Here's what was going on. When persecution came, the dominant church, so to speak, was lax, and the Novatianists were strict. And so as people would stray from the Lord and sometimes deny the Lord in persecution and then walk back in fellowship with the church, maybe the Novatianists were a little extra strict sometimes. We are human and humans are by nature, it seems, extremist. So maybe they were a little extra strict. But it was strict, godly church discipline versus laxity. And so there were some who lapsed and walked away from God. And the Novationist says, no. When these churches receive these people back, they make no active steps to guide them into discipleship and holiness. We're not even going to acknowledge them and have communion with them. We're not fellowshipping with them. They rejected also heretical baptisms. And so when these churches that received these people who would deny the Lord and walk away from the church during persecution, they would receive them back and they would not really discipline them like they needed to. They decided that, hey, if you want to come to our church from there, we're going to baptize you again. We're not even accepting. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? To some extent. Here's an interesting thing. Philip Schaff, who is no friend of the Novatian, described them as having moral earnestness. Said they continued down to the 6th century. You go back up into the areas into Asia Minor, and Schaff said they combined with the Montanist. They not only were associated with the Montanist in Africa, they were associated with the Montanist in Asia Minor. Why don't you call kin folks in the same house kin? Constantine got involved, the emperor. They said he was first mild, but then he prohibited their public worship and ordered their books to be burned. Here's an interesting thing. Even the formal church, so to speak, recognized the Novatianists were not heretics. They just didn't agree with them on holiness and separation. And it's here that I put a note. Wow, the more things get different, the more they stay the same, don't they? Well, I really like old Brother Joe. He's a good, solid Christian man, but he is so stinking strict that we can't fellowship. You just can't get along. He's just tough. He's too much. I mean, imagine that. 1,800 years ago, they were saying it about the Baptist. Here's an interesting thing, and I didn't get to dig into this. I have the book, but I didn't get to dig this far between being busy last week and just resting during the day was all I could do. But D.B. Ray, have y'all seen D.B. Ray's Baptist Succession? I sent that to y'all today, the ebook. It's a horribly formatted ebook, but get a hard copy if you want to. He quotes from Robinson's Ecclesiastical History. Robinson was a Protestant. Robinson says, the Novatians said, if you be a virtuous believer and will accede to our confederacy against sin, you may be admitted among us by baptism, or if any Catholic has baptized you before, by rebaptism. But mark this, if you violate the contract by lapsing into idolatry or vice, we shall separate you from our community, and do what you will, we shall never readmit you. They took church discipline seriously. So the order, that was actually Ray. It was Robinson who said they look upon every society which readmitted heinous offenders to communion as unworthy of the title of a true Christian church. They were strict. They didn't accept open communion church. They baptized, again, those whose first baptism they had grounds to doubt. They asserted that none ought to be admitted into churches, but such as were visibly true believers and real saints. They wanted, in other words, they believed in believers' baptism. To put it differently and more plainly, all churches then were still Baptist or they were heretics. And the Novatians were separatist Baptist. And that's why they were despised. They were not ever accused of any doctrinal heresy. They were just told, you're way too straight. After Constantine's supposed conversion, there was this, I'm going to call it a theopolitical union. He began to endorse the church and combine the church and the state. Because after all, he wants to unite his empire, and what better way to do it than a common religion? And so he did it under the banner of Christianity. But to do that, you have to unite the church. You also have to control the church. And even Philip Schaff said this was detrimental to the good of the church. Because on one hand, it led to civil and criminal penalties for spiritual offenses. And on the other hand, true discipline became weakened. Because, after all, if everybody's a member of the state and everybody becomes a member of the church, to be able to partake in state politics, all of that's going to suffer. Here we come again. There is a revival, Schaff says, of the rigoristic penitential discipline of the Montanists and Novatians under the Donatists in North Africa. Because in North Africa, there's a schism again that comes because of people who When Diocletian says, hand over your Bibles, hand over your books, and we're going to burn them, some of the preachers, some of the pastors, some of the church members says, no problem, just don't kill us, sir. When things settle down, they want to step back into their pulpits. They want to step back into their churches and say, well, we really didn't mean it. We were just trying to take care of our families. We were just trying to take care of our lives or something like that. This is up into the 4th century. The problem is, just like any other instance when church things like this happen, you have that glorious thing called politics. And there was a man who is hastily elected to be the bishop of Carthage. Here we are again, Carthage. Important place. One of the things that happened is Felix of a place called Aptungus or Aptunga was declared to have been one who had delivered up sacred writings to the heathen persecutors, and he's the one that's in charge of this ordination of Cecilian. And the Donatists said, no. We don't want anything to do with this. This is not a valid ordination. This guy's not a valid bishop. And so there's a man named Donatus who is a gifted man down there that people think a lot of, and they call him the Great. He's not the same as the one who is the Donatist in Rome and other places, that this movement's named after, but he was a busy man involved. They start taking sides. One big problem, the Donatists in Carthage appealed to Constantine to settle the issue. Even Schaff said they had to repent of it. Don't take your church problems to court, right? Y'all remember it's not been but 20 years ago, just down the road, the whole church property business went all the way up to the Mississippi Supreme Court. And look, that's not forgotten. And it doesn't help anything either. But here's the thing. The Donatists lost over and over again. 2 different investigations. Finally, the emperor himself spoke up and said no, issued penal laws against them, threatened them with banishment of their pastors and confiscation of their churches. You know what's going on here? Here's what the issue is at stake in the Donatist controversy. It's not just separatism and the purity of the church. It is the independence of local churches as the growing centralization of small letter C Catholicism heads toward big C Catholicism and Roman Catholicism and authoritarian rule. Constantine realized, though, in the early 4th century, that he probably ought to slack up, that it wasn't going to work to forcibly restrict them, and he gave them full liberty of faith and worship, the Donatists. And he was faithful to this and exhorted the Catholics to be patient and indulgent. And so when they had a council in 330, there were actually 270 Donatist bishops, pastors who were present. Things got worse. There was a Donatist bishop in Hippo of Africa. Hippo. Who was from Hippo? We say Augustine, Saint Augustine. There was a Donatist bishop there named Faustinus. He took a stand. Philip Schaff again. He's not a friend to the Donatist and Baptist, but he uses him as an example. He would not allow any of the members of his church to bake bread for the Catholic inhabitants of the city. This was serious separation. It was at the end of the 4th century, the beginning of the 5th, the great Augustine of Hippo sought to reconcile the Donatists with the Catholic Church By the way, I didn't call him great. Philip Schaff did. But do you get this? Augustine wants to persuade and instruct and make peace, and he writes on this. And I'm looking forward to the time that I get in my readings to see what he has to say about it. But as he wrote, Schaff said he set the whole African church in motion against them. Isn't it amazing? Oh, brother, we want to make peace. A few months ago, I had a brother call me up and say, I'd like to meet with you and brother so-and-so. I think we're not far off. Let's get together. Let's make peace. I think we can do this. Somebody said, you need to take a witness. I said, I think I can trust him. And the more I thought about it, the more the Lord convicted me, and I called a brother to go as witness. And guess what? By the time we were through, that man was right here on my nose screaming and spitting in my face saying, you a liar. And he later threatened me. Augustine was one of these violent peacemakers. I don't know if you've ever seen that the Lord, the little thing where said the Lord said, peace be still, and this peace be made of steel. that was his idea, you know. They made more stringent civil laws against them. They banished them from their country, fined the church members, confiscated their buildings, and in the early 5th century they were forbidden to meet together upon pain of death. And the great Augustine now advocated force to bring them into the fellowship of the church. The 5th century, we've heard about the Dark Ages. They started much earlier than you think. By the way, listen to Philip Schaff, please. Augustine himself, who had previously consented only to spiritual measures against heretics, now advocated force to bring them into the fellowship of the church, out of which there was no salvation. Up until this point, I have read no one saying this. Who says that? The Roman Catholics have said it for years. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. Guess where it came from? Augustine. And now, in the 20th and the 21st century, there are people calling themselves Reformed Baptists, embracing Calvinism, and they say, oh, how great Augustine was. No. He believed you had to be a member of the Catholic Church to be saved. Notice here the apparent death almost of religious freedom, the overruling and overwhelming authority of the Catholic Church, the will of the church, so-called, to use force as a matter of church discipline, and again, the role of the wonderful saint Augustine in these matters. But to sum it all up from D.B. Ray's Baptist Succession, he says, in regard to the Baptist character of these people, Osiander, a writer of the 16th century, affirms, and he quotes, that our modern Anabaptists were the same with the Donatists of old, and Fuller in his ecclesiastical history saith that the Anabaptists are the Donatists new dipped. Bullinger saith the Donatists and the Anabaptists held the same opinions of baptism. So, you know what we just did? We just connected all of those Jerusalem Baptists, Syrian Baptists, French Baptists, Galatian Baptists, African Baptists, all the way up to the European Baptists during the days of the Reformation. We just covered 1,200 years of Baptist. So I don't know exactly how this is all going to play out. I'll miss a week, couple of weeks. Then y'all said missions conference. So I figure I got about 2 or 3 weeks somewhere in there because we close out first Monday or second Monday in November. But either way, okay, that might give me 3 weeks. My plan is Waldensians 1 week, Welsh Baptist 1 week, and then tie them together to bring us as close as possible to the time of the Reformation, because the Waldensians and the Welsh Baptists, of course, are like all those Reynolds kids in the Reynolds house. They look alike. And nobody has to look and say, who's your daddy? They're all kin. Just like all of God's people are, and especially in God's faithful Baptist churches.